Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, we're talking win total projections for this year. We'll look at FanDuel's early win total projection for the Wolves and also with the folks at Bleacher Report and ESPN, their forecasts. There's some people actually picking the Wolves to have a shot to win the title, yet ESPN thinks they're going to finish significantly under their FanDuel win total. We'll break that all down and give my thoughts, also some FIBA World Cup notes. It's all coming to the show. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome into the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets, guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. Happy Friday, everybody. Happy weekend. Hopefully you've had a fantastic week so far. And a big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch the show on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app, which can be downloaded on either Roku or Amazon Fire TV. This show and all the other Minnesota Locked On podcasts are available there right now. You can also follow on Twitter or X, I guess, at Beecken with two B's, two E's, CKEN, or at Locked On T-Wolves. Don't forget the T. All right, going to acknowledge you're listening to this on Friday. Team USA is either currently playing or just finished a little bit ago. Or I guess if you're listening later in the day, maybe they finished this morning. Recording this podcast late Thursday night. So before the game, had it been like a 4:30 a.m. tip, I would have watched it before recording the show. But needed to record the show before Team USA's game on Friday. So I don't know the result as I'm recording this podcast. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on FIBA World Cup today. A couple of notes towards the end. And I'm planning to do a show. If the USA won on Friday, then they're playing the championship Sunday. If they lost, they'll play in the third place game. So either way, it'll be done by Monday. I do want to do not like a full FIBA World Cup recap, but almost kind of like a state of the narratives surrounding Anthony Edwards. If that sounds a little bit nebulous, it is. I'm still working on exactly how I'm gonna phrase this when I talk about it next week. But now that suddenly the national discourse, there's just so much of it about Anthony Edwards because of his prominence in the 35 points he scored in the game a couple 2 games ago against Lithuania. Like there's just much more discussion about Ant because he's on the stage he's on, and suddenly people are they're surprised by certain things and. He's actually a good defender, and man, he's really athletic. Like we knew these, like Timberwolves fans knew these things. People that follow the Timberwolves knew these things all season last year. He looks like the same Ant by and large that we saw last year. I've talked about that on the show, but I want to talk about like what is real. Like what did we see differently, or what did we see that was different from what we saw last year for the Wolves? And also, it's related to the conversation we're gonna have on the show today, which is the early win total projections. And kind of the prognosticating about the Timberwolves for the upcoming season. Offseason is not quite over. There's minor roster tweaking to happen. Who knows about the Damian Lillard stuff, the James Harden stuff? Like there's things still in the air. All this stuff can and will change in terms of these early projections. But most of it's not going to change a lot. And a lot of it is being influenced, at least Timberwolves wise, with the FIBA Ant stuff. I think it's all related. So we'll touch on it a little bit today, but I mostly want to focus on these win total projections, and then we'll get into the Ant FIBA stuff. Probably a whole show about it next week, just to kind of reset. Like, what is the opinion of Anthony Edwards here nationally? What's true? Like, sift through this noise that Timberwolves fans are going to be hearing. So we'll do that next week. Today, though, let's talk about the win total projection stuff. So some of this has been out for a couple of weeks, but there's been so much FIBA World Cup, so much Ant related to that I haven't spent a lot of time on win total projections here on the show. I did mention it a couple of weeks ago. I'd gone on Locked On Fantasy Basketball, done the Wolves show with Josh Lloyd, and given my Timberwolves win total projection that he forced me to do in early August. I have not officially made a prediction on this podcast. So if you watch that, you know what I said there. I don't know for sure that that's where I'm going to land because I like to wait until the last minute, until all the dust has settled from the offseason, even the preseason, kind of on the eve of the regular season is when I'll really truly make my prediction that I'll, hold my feet to the fire here on this show for what I predict. But I'm going to list off what some of the other, like, I'm going to tip my hand in a pretty strong way here by reacting to some of these other predictions. So the FanDuel, our friends over at FanDuel, their win total for the Wolves this year is 44.5. So if you're not familiar with sports betting, that just means if they win 45 or more games, you'd take the over. If they win 44 or less games, you would take the under. Of course, last year they won just 42 games. 2 years ago, though, they won 46 in the first full season under Chris Finch. The idea last year, I believe the win total at FanDuel was 47.5, if I remember correctly. And I said strongly before the season to take the over. I was wrong. My thought being, hey, they won 46 without Rudy Gobert. The roster's undoubtedly improved. Why would you not believe that they win at least 2 more games? I was clearly wrong. However, if Karl-Anthony Towns doesn't miss 53 games, I think I'm probably right. And I know that the data over the first 21 games or whatever before he got hurt maybe didn't suggest that. But I think over the course of 82 games, this team would have been an upper 40s, would have at least made a run at beating that 47.5 over-under from last year. Going into this season, Vegas, at least FanDuel, split the difference with 44.5, kind of in between where they were 2 years ago and where they were last year. I think that's probably about right. And I think it might have opened a little bit lower. I want to say it opened at 43.5 because I think Josh Lloyd took the slight under, if I remember correctly, at maybe 43 wins. But I think I'm actually pretty confident it opened at 43.5. And now, as I'm recording this on September 7th, it's 44.5. And I bet there's a bump from Ant at FIBA World Cup. I'm pretty confident that that's what's happening here, which again is a discussion for next week in and of itself. But FanDuel has the Timberwolves at 44.5 wins. Bleacher Report, and specifically Andy Bailey over at Bleacher Report, after the schedules were released, this was a few weeks ago, really. Well, actually, here, what's the date of the article? August 17th. So yeah, like 3 weeks ago. Andy Bailey over at Bleacher Report, who for the most part does a really good job. And I know not everything at Bleacher Report is great, but I think Andy does a good job. He had the Timberwolves as a 45-win team. I think that's perfectly reasonable. It is the over on the 44.5, barely. It's the slight over. And his case is basically, hey, this team's coming back. They were, he talks about Bruce Brown and the Nuggets talking about how difficult the Timberwolves were to play, the toughest postseason opponent for the Nuggets. Conley coming back to the team, a full season of Conley. And then he ultimately says getting to 50 wins could come down to Anthony Edwards. Basically, if Ant makes that leap, that could happen. Yeah, that all sounds good to me. So then you go over to ESPN. ESPN did this a little over a week ago. 2 weeks ago now. And they had a whole prediction series. And I want to talk about all of their different predictions that they did. But let's start with the win total, because this is the one that really kind of floored me. They broke up their Western Conference standings into contenders, play-in, and bottom 5. Similar to what they did last year. Once again, the Timberwolves did not manage to finish at the top 6, the contenders list in the Western Conference. And instead, and also, by the way, they're in the play-in group, but you're not going to believe this. The Timberwolves are number 10 in the Western Conference standings, according to the ESPN preseason predictions. And this is the way that they do this is they take like all their experts and they have them vote. And then they, based on that, there's like a point system, right? So the more number 1 seeds you get, the more points you get, the more 15s you get, the least points you get. And they kind of back into what the standings would look like. The Timberwolves are 10th on this list, technically tied for 9th with Dallas, both with 43 wins. And the only thing it says about the Wolves in the write-up is, could this be the year the Wolves jump into the top tier? Edwards signed his extension. Based on his performance at FIBA, could take another step toward being one of the league's marquee players. The team's hopes will likely depend on how well Rudy Gobert and Karl-Anthony Towns mesh during the season. I have thoughts on 43 wins as ESPN's prediction for the Wolves. And given that, this may surprise you, but there's folks at ESPN that also think the Wolves could go to the finals or win the Western Conference and go to the finals. And there's actually somebody who thinks the Wolves have a shot at winning the title. We'll talk about what that all looks like over at ESPN and my thoughts on that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends over at FanDuel. Get ready for the NFL season with incredible offers from FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. NFL opened up on Thursday night. The Detroit Lions jumping to first place. And then in the NFC North with a single point victory over the Kansas City Chiefs, doing more than just covering on the road against the defending champs. A really exciting game. But the great news is there's plenty to bet on, of course, all Sunday, football Sunday, and also Saturday, by the way, college football. But the NFL season specifically is a ton of fun over at FanDuel. Right now, new customers at FanDuel can bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Plus, all customers who bet $5 will get $100 off NFL Sunday ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Now is the best time to join and enjoy FanDuel. The app is easy to use. You can bet on everything from spreads to player props and more. So visit FanDuel.com/lockdown and kick off the NFL season with an offer you won't want to miss. Also, I mentioned the Timberwolves over-under win total, 44.5. I mean, I don't know that I'd smash the over, but I'm definitely leaning over for the Timberwolves this year. I was wrong last year, but I was right 2 years ago on that. So go check that out. FanDuel.com/lockdown. Kick off the NFL season with an offer that you won't want to miss. FanDuel, official partner of the NFL. A big thank you once again for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, everydayers will be back on Monday. And like I talked about, if the Team USA say they win the gold medal, or win I guess it is still a gold medal at the World Cup. We'll talk about that on Monday for sure. It's either going to be Monday or Wednesday of next week, depending on how the weekend goes. We're going to talk at FIBA. I already talked about that. Next week, we have 3 shows, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. The following week, the week of September 18th, we will be back to 5 shows per week. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. We will be truly daily throughout your work week and get you ready as training camps kick off. Media days like 2 weeks away. Then training camp. Preseason games are like a little less than a month away, I believe, is the first preseason game. So it's getting real really quickly. Again, next week, the last week of only 3 shows per week before we go back daily the week after next. All right. Continue this ESPN. My thoughts on ESPN's thoughts, I guess. The Timberwolves are tied for 9th in the Western Conference in their preseason predictions in the play-in group with 43 wins with Dallas. You'll recall last year, Dallas did not make the play-in. The Oklahoma City Thunder finished 10th. The Timberwolves beat them in the play-in. The Timberwolves also bested the New Orleans Pelicans in game 82 to force the Pelicans into that game with the Thunder, the first play-in, which they lost. And the way that they have this set up at ESPN is they've got it Nuggets, Suns, Warriors, Kings in the 4 spot, the Lakers in the 5. And really, like last year, I thought the Lakers' love was out of control for much of the year. I mean, it always is, right? But the Lakers have had a good offseason. The Clippers are 6th, which, I mean, I don't know. It's still only 2 games more than they have the Wolves winning at 43, right? Like all these teams are stuck between 43 wins for the Wolves and 47 for the Warriors. So you've literally got 8 teams within 4 wins of each other, according to this prediction, this rankings, which like, I get it. It's still only 2 games less than what Bleacher Report thought they'd win, but 43 seems really low to me. And to have them be below Dallas, Memphis, Oklahoma City, the Clippers, Lakers, and Kings, I mean, certainly you can argue that. Like, it's not crazy. It just seems a little bit low. And then I should also finish out the bottom 5 in the West. They've got the Pelicans at 42 wins, only 1 win behind the Timberwolves and Dallas at 11. The Jazz at 12, 5 games back. Then an 8-game drop to the Rockets at 13th, 29 wins. Another 2 games to the Spurs at 14th, and then the Blazers with 24 wins in the 15 spot. Assuming Dame is moved, that feels about right to me. So that doesn't seem crazy. But then when you contrast it with some of the other stuff that ESPN put out in these predictions, and I'm assuming this is the same panel of voters, to win the Western Conference Finals, the Denver Nuggets the way this works is you could vote for 3 teams if you're on their panel. First, your number 1 on your ballot for who you think is most likely to win the finals gets 5 points. Your number 2 gets 3 points, and your number 3 gets a single point. The Denver Nuggets got 106 points on this panel. 76% of first place votes went to the Nuggets to win the Western Conference. Not surprising. They won it last year. It's going to be virtually the same team this coming season. The Suns are 2nd, which surprised me a little. Golden State 3rd, the Lakers 4th, and then a big drop-off. Phoenix had 60 points, Warriors 27, Lakers 24. Big drop-off to the Clippers in 5th with 6 points. Tied for 6th with a single point each, the Sacramento Kings and your Minnesota Timberwolves. there was one panelist out of certainly a couple dozen at least that gave the Timberwolves a single third place vote, if you will, to advance to the NBA Finals. That means one voter thought the Wolves were the third most likely team to win the Western Conference this year. We'll take it, right? It doesn't jive with the 43 wins thing, but who knows? Maybe that particular panelist also had the Timberwolves winning 50 plus games. We don't know. So that was surprising to me because we don't see that very often. And then the more surprising one, who will win the NBA Finals? There's only 8 teams in the entire NBA that got a vote, that got any sort of a vote for this. The Nuggets got 80 points, 48% of the first place votes. A distant second, the Bucks with 49 points, 28% of first place. Then the Celtics, Suns, Heat, Warriors, Lakers, all the usual suspects. From 80 points to Denver, down to 6 for the Warriors, 5 points for the Lakers, which again, that would mean that with 5 points, that means either one person said they're the most likely to win the finals, or you might have had, 1 second place vote for 3 points and 2 third place votes with 2 points. The Minnesota Timberwolves were one of only 8 teams in the entire NBA to get at least a vote, a top 3 vote for winning the finals. Somebody gave the Timberwolves a third place vote, meaning one of the panelists thought the Wolves were the third most likely team to win the finals this year. That was a genuine surprise to me. I was not expecting that. It means nothing, of course, but I was not expecting it. And it was a pleasant surprise. It also, I think, is another, I don't know when they took this vote, but if it was any time in the last 3 weeks, there's a FIBA bump there. There has to be a FIBA bump. It's kind of like the Hard Knocks bump for NFL fans. If everybody thinks the team on on Max's Hard Knocks every year is going to be better in the NFL. That's what this is. It's a FIBA bump for the Timberwolves and for Anthony Edwards. Other ESPN NBA predictions: who will win the NBA MVP? Anthony Edwards tied for 9th in the voting with 5 points. He received 3.8% of the first place vote. So that means he had 1 vote, and it was somebody that voted him as as their MVP candidate. It doesn't mean he got a second to 2/3. It means he got a first place vote for NBA MVP behind, of course, Jokic, Giannis, Luka Doncic, Jason Tatum, Joel Embiid, Kevin Durant, Devin Booker, Steph Curry, and Jimmy Butler. Edwards was tied with Kawhi Leonard for 9th in MVP, preseason MVP voting. Of course, the Wolves had nobody on the Rookie of the Year voting. Defensive Player of the Year, this was interesting. Rudy Gobert actually tied for 5th in the voting behind Jaren Jackson Jr., the reigning champion, or reigning Defensive Player of the Year, I guess. Bam Adebayo, Giannis, Evan Mobley, Marcus Smart, Mikal Bridges. Gobert tied with Mikal Bridges for 5th with 17 points. He received 11.5% of the first place votes. That looks like it's 3 first place votes. 3 panelists believed that Gobert would be the Defensive Player of the Year this year. Now, what does that tell me? That actually tells me a little bit more than some of the other stuff we've already talked about. Because if you think Gobert is going to win Defensive Player of the Year, that means you think the Timberwolves are going to be really good this year. Right? I mean, the Defensive Player of the Year always comes from a good team, almost by definition, because you're helming, if you're the best Defensive Player of the Year, your team doesn't have a bad defense. And obviously the Wolves, they weren't a great offensive team last year, but they're not going to be worse with a healthy Karl-Anthony Towns. So I would be willing to bet that whoever this was that thought Ant could win MVP might be the same person that thought the Wolves could win the finals or win the Western Conference, could have also thought that Rudy Gobert is going to win Defensive Player of the Year. But the fact that there were 3 writers who gave Gobert first place Defensive Player of the Year votes or prediction votes this year is really surprising to me. Jaden McDaniels was 9th on the list, by the way, with 7 points, no first place votes, which means it looks like he got most likely he got he would have gotten 2 second place votes and a third place vote for, again, it sounds weird to say second and third place because they're still predictions. So second most likely or third most likely to win. Between Gobert and McDaniels are Anthony Davis, Draymond Green, Brook Lopez, and then McDaniels got more votes than Robert Williams of the Celtics, and then several players that also received some level of voting for this. But to have 2 Timberwolves in the top 10 for potential Defensive Player of the Year voting was, again, surprising. Also surprising, nobody voted for Chris Finch out of, let's see, how many coaches got votes? 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. 14 coaches appeared on a ballot for the top 3 potential choices for Coach of the Year. Finch wasn't one of them. So whoever this was that thinks the Wolves could go to the finals, could win the Western Conference, that Ant could win MVP, that thinks Gobert or Jaden McDaniels could win Defensive Player of the Year, does not think the same about Chris Finch. Of course, it's not fun to just pick one team to win everything. So I'm sure that there doesn't have to be a rhyme or reason to it. I just thought it was really interesting that's kind of that's where these results all landed for these ESPN predictions. Very, very much preseason predictions. We're still, when these were made, it was still late August. So pretty fascinating. And don't get me wrong, we're not done with prediction season. There's still more player ranking lists upcoming. We did the athletic tiers a few weeks ago. There's going to still be more player rankings. There are going to be lots more season predictions that we'll talk about. And we'll get to that. We'll get to that here in the next couple of weeks. A couple of quick notes to finish the show. Timberwolves podcast mentions Chris Finch on a podcast. Kind of want to talk about a few of those things. And then again, briefly touch on the Ant stuff related to FIBA we'll get to next week. So we'll do all that here next. Timberwolves head coach Chris Finch appeared on JJ Redick's podcast. I think it released on Thursday, actually. Full disclosure, I have not watched or listened to the full interview yet. I did read a few quotes from it. I saw the tease that JJ Redick put out there to promote it. If you're not familiar, the podcast is The Old Man and the Three, and it's one of the most listened to NBA podcasts that's out there. So go check it out if you have not listened to it yet. I'm gonna listen to it this weekend. So I'm not going to comment too much on what I read because I haven't watched or listened to the whole thing yet, but it really sounds like Finch and Redick go in depth on offense, and Finch talked about the need to run a more structured offense this year, realizing that, remember last season leading into the year, he talked about placing, but actually it might have even been 2 years ago, putting bumpers around the offense and allowing it to be free flow and let the players make decisions. And he learned last year, having multiple bigs on the floor, that you need to kind of orchestrate this stuff a little bit more. It's different than if you're playing small ball with five guys that are essentially positionally interchangeable. That's not the case with the 7-foot Rudy Gobert. And at least, offensively, it might be true with Karl-Anthony Towns, but it's not on defense. It's not probably how Chris Finch would ideally want to play, but it's the hand he's been dealt. And that this is me talking, not Finch, obviously. But they have a conversation centered around structuring the offense to allow for better spacing, to allow for more three-point shot attempts, to better orchestrate the movements of both Rudy and Cat. So listen to that this weekend. I may touch on that a bit Monday. Again, kind of depends on how FIBA shakes out, but I'm really excited to listen to the interview. I just didn't get a chance to do it on Thursday. So again, Chris Finch on The Old Man and the Three. That's the JJ Redick podcast. And of course, he was almost positive he was on the staff in New Orleans when Redick was there briefly at the end of his career. I'm pretty sure that it was that season. Finch was in New Orleans for a couple years, I guess. But anyway, they obviously are familiar with each other from their time in the league. So go check out that interview. I'm excited to listen to it myself. Another note, there was an extensive, the Ringer podcast network, the Bill Simmons podcast on the Ringer podcast network is, I've given my thoughts on Bill Simmons in the past. I enjoy Bill Simmons for what he is. I'm not going to get into a Bill Simmons self-argument here about him. I enjoy his podcast for the entertainment value that they provide. I think his NBA takes are entertaining, even if I don't always agree. Like his take on the Rudy Gobert trade last year may not actually turn out to be wrong, but I thought it was clumsy, I guess would be the best. Heavy-handed and clumsy would maybe be the best way to put it. But he does this whole thing on his pod this week. I think it was Tuesday's show, or maybe it was Wednesday. It was after the Lithuania game, but before the Italy win. So I think it was Tuesday's podcast on the Bill Simmons podcast. He had Rob Mahoney on, and they talked about Anthony Edwards and compared Ant to Dwayne Wade, which is, a comp that's been made before. Eric Spoelstra made it just a couple of weeks ago, actually, because I think he was asked which player of the team reminds him most of Dwayne Wade, and he said Ant. That was always the comp for, remember when Deion Waiters came out of college, and that's what people said best case was Dwayne Wade because he was a smaller guard, bigger body, strength, score in the paint, etc., high volume. Ant is so much more athletic than Deion Waiters. He's already a better shooter than Deion Waiters. So, obviously, that was kind of my worst case comp for Ant coming out, with somebody like a Deion Waiters, right? Obviously, Anthony Edwards is between Deion Waiters and Dwayne Wade at this moment in time. Is his ceiling as high as Dwayne Wade? Yeah, absolutely. Which is sounds crazy because he's a Hall of Famer, but it's not crazy. Remember, he's 22. And this podcast interview, they Mahoney and Simmons go through talking about, Mahoney talks a little bit about how Ant's athleticism really pops in FIBA competition because the athleticism gap is so much greater between Ant and the majority of players in the World Cup versus even in the NBA, which is true. And they talk about how good he is defensively and how impressive he is on the ball. And this is kind of where, like, again, we'll get to this next week, start banging my head against the wall a little bit because, like, hey, if you've watched Ant at all, maybe not his rookie year, but the last 2 seasons, he's been a lockdown one-on-one defender the majority of the time. Yeah, off the ball, he's been shoddy, and on the ball, it could be a little spotty depending on the matchup and the motivation level of Ant. But when motivated, and part of that is the matchup, right? Ant can absolutely be, and I've said this, I feel like every other show for the past 6 weeks, he can easily be a top 5 on-ball defender in this league and is currently when he is locked in. And that's, of course, the operative word is when, right? Like, and that's a big part of the battle. It's can he become a true all defensive player by being on, quote unquote, on the vast majority of the time? That's the biggest question. But the physical gifts are there. And it's not just that he's big and athletic, and so therefore the physical gifts are there. He's actually shown it in practice. Like, he has been an elite defender on the ball for stretches. Can he do it more consistently? Can he pay a little bit more attention off the ball, right? But like that and the offensive stuff isn't all that different from what we've seen from Ant the last couple of seasons, last season and a half or so in a Timberwolves uniform. So a lot of the conversation between Mahoney and Simmons is them kind of discovering this stuff that Timberwolves fans already know. And then they do talk a little bit about Ant and could he raise the ceiling of the Wolves, or really, well, both the floor and the ceiling, and the discussion of like, hey, if the floor is being a good team in the West, like they've got a pretty solid floor because they know that Ant could get them. Can Ant get them from that floor of 40 some wins to the ceiling of whatever Ant's ceiling is? And they talk about the clunky pieces, etc. But I also think at the same time, it's such a weird thing that, again, I keep getting ahead of myself. We'll talk about this next week. I think this is equal parts people overrating how good Ant is now and underrating how good he was last year. It's weird, but that's where we're at. Like that's what I want to talk about next week is why I'm convinced that Anthony Edwards is better than people thought he was, nationally at least, all of last season, basically. But he's not as good as people think he is now based on watching FIBA and based on, thinking what his impact will be on the season. I hope I'm wrong. Like, I hope that he walks onto the court in October and he's a top 10 NBA player immediately. I just don't think we're quite there yet. The answer is somewhere in the middle, as it often is. And I say that a lot on this podcast because it's true. There's a lot of room in that middle. It's a player is usually better than a lot of people think he is and worse than some other people think he is. That's just, it sounds like such a silly thing to say, but I think it's important to point it out. And I think that the discourse surrounding Anthony Edwards that's kind of where we're at this point. All right. So we'll save the rest of that for next week. As you can tell, I've got a lot to say about the topic. So we'll get to it. Hopefully USA won today and then plays for the gold medal on Sunday. We'll talk about that on Monday's show. And again, Monday, Wednesday, Friday next week. Otherwise, that's all we have for you today. And then week after next, the week starting with Monday, September 18th, we'll be back to daily Monday through Friday. Excited to do that. Excited to get into some season preview stuff. And then training camp and preseason starts, and we're off and running. A big thank you to those that do make Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms, wherever you like to listen to podcasts. You can find this one. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And you can follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.